Hello and welcome to Night Guys Gaming. I'm very excited to present the Seer Council deep dive that I've been putting together after quite a bit of experience playing many games with the Seer Council detachment, making it something that I believe is one of the most powerful and most fun to play detachment that we have in the Codex. And this is going to be a deep dive. I want to get into the weeds, I want to get into the details, talk about the synergies, specific units, specific strategies, how the stratagems can work together, and really help players, both advanced and beginners, learn how to use this attachment even better and have more success with it on the table. So, with all that in mind, let's dig in. I realized after putting this content together that there was just so much that I needed to split it up into a couple videos, and so this is how I'm going to split the videos up. You can see the content that we're going to be going over in each one. This video is going to be going over the detachment, the rules, enhancements, and stratagems, and then starting to get into the synergies. The second video is going to be covering the units and put into tier list for this detachment. I've seen a lot of different tier lists out there for the Eldar units, and I feel like it's a little bit of a disservice because, as often as even noted in those tier list videos, each unit is different depending on the detachment it's in and the synergies it has with each specific detachment. And so I think a general tier list just doesn't help a whole lot, whereas one that's devoted to just the detachment is much more focused and will be more beneficial. So that is going to be what I'm doing in the next video. And after that, I'll be going into some of the math behind why those units are good and then how those units benefit from some of the synergies that are built into the detachment. And then after that, we'll go into some sample lists of how to put the list together. And finally, in the second video, we'll be going into strategy and tactics specific to the detachment. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with this first part here and get into the detachment itself. So for the overview of the detachment, I want to keep this a little bit light because I think this is something that you can do just by reading the rules yourself. But I am going to go into some detail about the detachment that maybe you wouldn't have picked up on at first glance or just at your first read through, and hopefully get some perspective on some things that maybe you didn't think about. So first of all, let's talk about the detachment rule being fate dice and talk about what benefit that brings. So as far as strengths, the fate dice in essence give us an extra 6 CP. Each dice is correlated to one of the stratagems, and so it's really kind of straightforward and generally not exactly the strongest detachment rule, but what it does for us is front load our CP. So most players are starting the game with 1 CP, and then on their turn they might get a second, and depending on who went first, they might even have 3. But in either case, when you're playing Seer Council, you're starting with those 6 dice that give you access to your stratagems, and in one sense, you're starting the game with 7 CP, and really, in one sense, 8, because Eldrad is pretty much always going to be taken. And it allows you to use a lot of stratagems early, which can give you a big advantage over your opponent because we can use our dice for stratagems in our detachment, which allows us to really use the CP that we naturally generate and is also given to us by Eldrad to use on the core stratagems as well. And so by round 2 or 3, you can have spent so much more on stratagems than your opponent, it can give you a very big advantage. And so that's one of the main strengths the detachment brings as far as this rule up front. And as far as a weakness, we have limited control. So you're really rolling dice. And so even though I just said that, yeah, it's kind of like playing with 8 CP right up front, well, that's in a perfect world where you roll 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And we all know that that's pretty much rarely going to happen. And so you're going to have some doubles, maybe even a triple, and it's going to limit some of the things you can do with your dice. And so that is one of the main weaknesses of the detachment rule itself. but we do have an enhancement that I'll talk a bit more in detail later that gives us a little bit of control back, and that's Lucid Eye. So Lucid Eye allows us to add 1 or subtract 1 from the value of the dice so that we can use that dice for a different stratagem. And so we can alter it enough that we can sometimes squeeze out a bit more efficiency out of our detachment rule. And so we have something to help us with that weakness. And the third thing I wanted to mention is just, I think that the detachment itself is really the fact that the stratagems are kind of supercharged. They're very good stratagems. We have a couple that are, I won't call them weak, but they're gonna sometimes have less value into certain matchups. But in general, we have very good stratagems across the board. All 6 can be used in a lot of games and do very strong effects and change what happens on the table. So I think that is one of the greatest strengths of Seer Council, and I can't emphasize enough how much versatility and strength that we get from our stratagems. And so with that in mind, let's continue on into enhancements. And I put on the top Lucid Eye because I already kind of mentioned it. It does help us with our weakness. I do think it's kind of expensive. And I've talked to other players who have played Seer Council and had a lot of experience with it, and this is something that's a little bit in contention. I do not think myself that Lucid Eye is necessary or an auto take. I know some people believe that it is, and when I first started playing them, I also thought that it was 100% necessary and I couldn't build a list without it. But I have to say, after playing games, and quite a few of them, without Lucid Eye, I think we can play without it just fine. You are taking a little bit of a risk that you might roll some dice you don't want into specific matchups, because we do have some stratagems that are really low value into certain matchups, and we'll get into that as well. And so you're taking a little bit of a risk, but in my experience, you're generally still going to be able to use most of your dice. And Lucid Eye can sometimes actually bring little value at all if you roll pretty normal dice and you can easily use all of them. Then that enhancement was basically 30 points wasted. So I think that it is something that each player will have to take into consideration and probably figure out themselves if they just can't handle not having a little bit of control of the dice, or if they're willing to, in some cases, miss out on a couple dice in order to save those 30 points. And so I think it's going to end up being up to the player and your style of play. But my recommendation is play with it and play without it, and then decide for yourself whether or not you can build your lists without it. But I do think you need to try playing without it to really get a full idea on whether or not it has value for your style of play or not. And so continue on to Runes of Warding. Runes of Warding is a weird one. It has an interesting effect that I think is beneficial, but I think it's very expensive. And one of the reasons I think it's very expensive is because we have to put it on a Warlock or a Farseer, basically. And that just doesn't help much. So getting some protection from mortal wounds and psychic attacks is very uncommon in certain matchups, or in a lot of matchups, I should say. And the other factor is, if somebody's going to be throwing grenades or tank shocking or just in some way doing mortal wounds or to a unit that has a Farseer in it, the Farseers and Warlocks are generally going to be with Guardians. And if they're going to spend CP to throw some grenades at my Guardians, I'm okay with that. They're very low value models. They're around 9 points per model. And so if they throw some grenades and they kill 20 some points of my army and they spent a CP to do that, I'm generally going to be okay with that. Now, there are some blast psychic attacks that some factions have where this will come in handy, but I think it's too expensive to have it for those small cases, a small number of cases, I should say. And so, in general, I think we just skip that one and we can put those points to good use elsewhere. Stone of Elder's Fury is basically pointless. There are small cases where you could argue you could use an Eldritch Storm along with the Bright Lance on a platform with the Guardian Defenders, and that way you're getting a little extra attacks in, especially in the early turns of the game where you're keeping your Guardians back. But I think for those points, again, we're better off just putting those into our army, and I don't particularly love the idea of trying to work things out where we can make our Farseer shoot 36 inches instead of 24. I just don't think it has enough effect to be worth the points. If it was like 5 points, I'd probably throw it in there because it would be helpful, but I think at its current price, it's just kind of pointless and it doesn't affect the game enough to be worthwhile. And so, in my opinion, it's a pass. And then lastly, the Torque of Moray Heg. I think it's our best enhancement. That said, I still don't think it's an auto take. I definitely think it's something you can do without. But if it came down to it and I had to build a list and had to include an enhancement, I'd actually probably pick Torque even before Lucid Eye, which sounds, I know, crazy. But part of it is the price. Torque is 20 points, whereas Lucid Eye right now is 30. And I've actually gotten much more value out of Torque than I have Lucid Eye in more of the games that I've played where I've had either one or both. And the big reason for that is, again, this is going on a Warlock or Farseer, and the style that I've generally played with Seer Council is to have a Farseer with some Conclave in a Guardian Defender squad. And that Farseer having Torque is just so nice because he will take the unit and they will teleport into enemy lines or get close enough, usually within 12 inches because I want my Warlock Conclave to be using their flamethrowers, of course, or their destructors. And so I'm already going to be in that range. And then this enhancement makes it so that my opponent has a lose-lose situation. If they want to protect the unit that I'm targeting, and I'm going to target something that they're probably going to want to protect with this brick, they are going to have to spend an extra CP if they want to use a defensive stratagem. And if they don't have enough CP, or if they just deem that 2 CP isn't worth, -1 to hit or whatever it might be, Armor of Contempt, they're not going to be defending one of the units that they would like to defend. And so really they lose if they spend 2 CP on a stratagem that shouldn't cost that much, and they lose if they don't spend any CP because now I have free reign to do max damage into that unit. And so I think Torque just puts opponents in a bad situation, and it can either hurt our opponent's defense capability or it can hurt their CP economy, both of which are very good things to do to an opponent. Okay, so getting into the stratagems, the exciting stuff. I am going to cover these in the order in which they correlate with the dice that you roll. And so we'll be starting with Presentiment of Dread. And I want to lightly touch on what they do, but really focus more on how to use them, when to use them, and some like special case uses, or maybe some things that maybe you didn't think about how they could be used, and some of the way that the rules interact with our stratagems. And so the first one here, Presentiment of Dread, is basically a forced battle shock, and it can be done in either player's command phase, and that's really good because it kind of gives us an offensive and defensive way of using the ploy. And so we can use it in our own command phase if we want to, in essence, defend one of our own points. And so we can cause an opponent to take a battle shock test if they're just contesting one of our objectives and they have a unit on it, but they didn't kill our unit. And so if we force them to take a battle shock and they fail it, their OC goes to 0, and now we can score our primary because we're doing this before the scoring part of our command phase. And so we want to use it on an opponent in that case. Another case where we might use it in our own command phase is on a unit that we don't want to allow to use stratagems. And one of the cool aspects of this stratagem in conjunction with one of our enhancements is you can really limit the capabilities of your opponent to use stratagems. And if you force them to take a battle shock test on a unit and they fail, they can't use stratagems on that unit. And then if you have a Farseer, for example, with the Torque, then you have another whole 12-inch circle where if they want to use stratagems, it's going to cost even more. So now they have a unit they can't use stratagems on, and then they have a whole bunch of units possibly where if they want to use stratagems, it's going to cost an extra CP. And so we can really make things difficult on our opponent with this. Another way to use this is in your opponent's turn. And this can be used in what I call the offensive manner. And what you want to do is use this in the command step of their command phase. So the command phase is set up with your command step and then a battle shock step. So there's two steps there. You want to use it before the battle shock step. And so that's when you want to announce it pretty early on in their command phase. And the reason for this is it allows you to avoid insane bravery. They're not allowed to use insane bravery outside of the battle shock step of their command phase. And that's an important distinction, and it allows us to force them to go ahead and take that battle shock at -1. And you can do it on a unit that is already going to take a battle shock test. And so there are instances where you might be able to make your opponent make 2 battle shock tests in order to score their primary. And what's really nice about the stratagem is just the help that it gives us on some primary objective control or denying it from our opponent. And that's something where Eldar in general just struggle a bit, is holding primaries and winning on the primary front. And so this does help us with that weakness. One last thing that I want to mention about this in an offensive case is it can also force our opponent to have a difficult decision to make if we can force a battle shock test on a unit that's engaged with us that we know they want to have fall back. Whether it's the fact that they have a fallback and shoot ability or stratagem, or they're just in with our Howling Banshees and they don't want to be there. If we can force them to take that battle shock and they fail, for them to get out of that, they're going to have to take a desperate escape test, which they are definitely not going to want to have to do. And so it can be used offensively in that matter as well. And so that is something to keep in mind if you're trying to, again, just put your opponent in some difficult situations. Okay, so the next stratagem, Forewarned, is pretty straightforward, so I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this one in particular because it pretty much says what it does, and that's -1 to hit, -1 to wound for the entire fight phase. And it is a very good defensive stratagem when going against combat armies. Obviously, it's not going to help as much if the opponent is pretty much all shooting, and so this is one of those stratagems that is very strong, but not necessarily very strong into every faction. And so if you're going against Tau, you might not use this much. If you're going against World Eaters, Blood Angels, then you may be using this quite often. This will sometimes surprise opponents because they're just not going to suspect our infantry to be so difficult to kill, because the -1 to hit throws off some math in the 17-80% range of their damage is going to go down. And the -1 to wound is huge because it almost makes our infantry act as if they're Terminators when it comes to toughness, or Orc boys in that sense. And so those strength 4 and 5 weapons are going to be winning on 4s. The strength 6 weapons, instead of winning on 2s, are now on 3s. And so it's really going to make it much more difficult for them to wound our squishy infantry. And so keep this in mind. Try to keep your infantry near Psykers, especially ones where you're expecting a possible charge, because this can really help our infantry survive and then hit back even harder when the opponent comes charging in. So that is basically it for Forewarned. The only little caveat I want to add to Forewarned is pay attention to it on our Warlock Conclave bricks, because with the Warlock Conclave and they're being led by a Farseer or Eldrad, since he's also a Farseer, they're already going to give you -1 to wound. And so this is only going to effectively give you -1 to hit on those bricks. And so just take that into consideration and think whether or not it's really worthwhile. -1 to hit is still definitely valuable. And in some cases, like if they're getting charged by a Harlequin troop squad that's going to have +1 to wound, or something that has lance, then full send it, because that -1 to hit, -1 to wound on top of the warlocks already having -1 to wound is going to actually counter your opponent's lance or +1 to wound. So do pay attention to that. There's a few little weird situations where it might come up, but that's pretty much all I wanted to say on Forewarned. So let's move on to the next stratagem. All right, Unshrouded Truth. This stratagem, our third stratagem here, is one of the defining stratagems, and in my opinion kind of helps us decide how to build this detachment and what units to take and what to think about what we're doing with our army. It's a core stratagem that you're going to be using into any faction, any army, and is one that is really, I think, a defining piece of this detachment. So this one I'm going to spend a little more time on, so let's buckle in and get into this one. It basically is a remove the infantry off the table and set them back up on the battlefield. Again, it still has the same restrictions: no Wraith, has to be 9 inches of Psyker, no visibility requirements. So similar to other stratagems, but we then set it up on the battlefield 9 inches away from our opponent's units. And so it's very similar to Deep Strike, but it is not Deep Strike, so Baharath can not come just outside of 6. He does have to be 9 inches out. And it is, in one sense, a teleport, because we're doing it in our own movement phase, so the timing of it is interesting. There is a restriction to pay attention to, and that is that after you use the stratagem and move the unit, that unit cannot move again until after the end of that phase. And so that doesn't stop us from doing a lot of things. So Asserman, he can still move after he shoots, because now you're in the shooting phase. So he can still teleport, shoot, and then move. You can also still charge, because that's another phase. Because this is done in our movement phase, we are still going to be able to do a lot of our other movement abilities that we do in the other phases. I think that this is our most versatile stratagem. The ability to effectively perform a Deep Strike turn 1 is just fantastic. We put a mental stress load on our opponent from turn 1. They have to always be concerned with us putting a unit in their deployment zone or getting behind their lines and now getting angles onto units they don't want us to have angles on, and get places they don't want us to be. And so this stratagem just creates a headache for our opponents. It also allows us to have perfect positioning. We can put our units exactly the distance we want, where we want them on the ruin or just outside the ruin, taking a sharp angle so that maybe they have a flamethrower of some sort, a torrent weapon, and we don't want to get hit by the entire squad. And so now we can put our units to where we can just see one of their models. And so if they overwatched us, it would only be one singular model that gets to shoot against us. The use cases just go on and on. There's really so many different ways we can use the positioning advantage that this gives us to position our units in a way that we can benefit from. We can put our Farseer squad right at, the Warlocks at 12 inches and the Farseer at 12 inches, so they get all their singing spears and everything behind it so that we're as safe as possible. We can bring down units that normally don't have Deep Strike. And so your fire dragons and things that your opponent don't want to just show up in the middle of the board in front of a monster can just all of a sudden be 9 to 12 inches away and blasting away. And this is just such a threat that is so hard to screen out because it is something that they have to worry about every single turn. And even beyond just a threat to our opponent, it's also something that we can use defensively. And we can use to score secondaries. We can get units where we need them to be to score secondaries. We can put our units at exact distances that we want them to be to benefit from whatever type of shooting they have. Or, for example, our Dark Reapers in the very corner of a board so that they can be shooting as far as possible and be as safe as they can, shooting into the chosen target they want to be. And it allows us to have force concentration. So we can position a unit that is on one side of the board to a complete opposite side that we need to push on, from one flank to the other, in order to apply all of our strength and our forces that are specialist units, because as we know, Eldar are generally a bunch of specialists. They like to shoot into specific targets. And so if we can teleport a unit so that it gets the angle on the type of target it likes to shoot, it's just an incredibly useful and advantageous stratagem to have. Now, going along with the defensive ideas, one of the restrictions that this stratagem does not have is anything to do with being an engagement. There's no restriction that we can't do this even if the unit is engagement. So we can pull the unit out of combat. So if somebody does charge into our Guardian squad that does not want to be in combat, we can use it almost like a fallback and shoot, because we're picking them up, we're putting them down. There's no restriction to them shooting, there's no restriction to them charging afterwards, and so we can still do secondary actions. And it just really gives us the freedom to do what we need to do with a unit on each one of our turns. And there's so many little tiny niche things to consider. For example, there's no desperate escape test, so even if our opponent wraps completely around our unit and there's no way for us to fall back without going over one of their models, and so we'd have to take a desperate escape test, well, that's not a problem because we're just picking them up and we're putting them down somewhere else. Now, I will say this isn't exactly like fall back and shoot, because there are instances where we'd love to just fall back like a couple inches, stay on an objective, and shoot our opponent. And so it's not exactly the same, but it is one thing to keep in mind, that you can get great value out of one of your shooting units that is stuck in engagement that you would love to be able to shoot at a target, and this stratagem gives you that option. One thing I also want to point out is with Baharoth specifically, like I mentioned, he does have to land outside of 9 inches of your opponent's unit, but he is still being set up on the board. And that is the only requirement for him to benefit from his critting hits on his ballistic skill rolls. So generally speaking, when you pick him up and put him down with a stratagem, he's still going to be crit hitting on 2s, so he's going to be getting his lethal hits on 2-ups when he rolls his hit roll, his four shots. And so it's a nice little backup plan for if our opponent was able to tag Baharoth and the Hawks in combat and they survive, and we would like to get them out of that combat. Baharoth is still going to benefit completely from his critical hit rule, and that's a pretty nice little tiny niche case that you may have missed. And then lastly, like I mentioned, again, I just have to emphasize this, the ability for us to get into our opponent's deployment zone at pretty much any stage of the game is just not only a big threat, but just a difficult thing for opponents to figure out how to deal with, and becomes even more scary in the late game. And some opponents just almost give up to the fact that we are going to get their home objective, and there's going to be little way for them to stop our mobility from keeping us from scoring secondaries and things of that nature. They just really can't afford to keep us screened out in pretty much any cases that I've played for the whole game. And so we're going to be able to get some places they don't want us to be. And that's just something that is absolutely fantastic about Unshrouded Truth. All right, on to the fourth one, Fate Inescapable. This is our offensive stratagem that gives us ignore cover and bonus AP on critical wounds. 9-inch range from Psykers, no visibility requirements. Right off the bat, I want to point out that ignores cover is what provides most of the benefit. In my opinion, in the math that I've done, which we will get into more in the next video, but I do want to point out here, it's really one of the best stratagems to use on our Guardian brick that have the Warlock Conclave and Farseer, because the Warlock Conclave Destructors have Torrent, but unlike most Torrent weapons in the game, or flamethrower style weapons in the game, that does not innately have ignores cover. So this ignores cover is a huge bonus to the damage that our Warlock Conclave does. And when you look at the math, it really helps us into targets that have 2-up saves and 3-up saves. When you look at a target that has a 2-up save that's in cover, you're effectively gaining 100% more damage into that target, because they are now failing on 1s and 2s instead of just 1s. And so the math there is showing that you're basically doubling your damage. And so it is very effective into targets that have good saves. It's also decent for Swooping Hawks and Dire Avengers. And Warp Spiders already have ignore cover, so obviously it's not going to help them much. And the bonus AP on critical wounds is such a small buff to damage that I don't believe you would hardly ever spend the CP to get that and only have that benefit. And the Hawks will see a good couple bits of damage, and it kind of depends on targets, but they do like it. And obviously the Dire Avengers, having their AP1 built in, like the ignore cover and the extra bit of AP when they get to shoot with it. It is only in your shooting phase, so you can't use it in Overwatch, so don't try to use it for an Overwatch. And really, that's pretty much it. The stratagem is okay. It gives us a little extra offensive punch with our Warlock Conclaves, and that is generally, I would probably say 90+% of the times that I use the stratagem, it's on the Guardian brick, because that Guardian brick has the Bright Lance and the Farseer, and the Farseer likes having ignores cover with Eldritch Storm. The Bright Lance likes ignores cover when it's shooting tough targets, because a lot of times those tough targets have 2-up or 3-up saves, and so that AP3 really hurts when they ignore cover. And so it's just a very good stratagem on that brick in particular, and I think that is what you're going to want to plan on using it on in most of your games. And really, that's pretty much all I want to say about Fate Inescapable. Although, now that I think about it, I didn't mention the Dark Reapers also don't benefit much from it, because they already ignore cover, so don't put it on them either. Just kind of pay attention to that. Don't put it on things that ignore cover innately, and you'll pretty much be good to go. The Guardian brick with Warlock Conclave and Farseer combo just really likes it, so just stick to putting it on them, and that'll get you the best bang for your buck. I mean, you got to remember that the Guardian Defenders pretty much put out similar firepower to the Dire Avengers, and on top of that you have the Conclave with the Singing Spears, and the Singing Spears ignoring cover and sometimes getting that extra punch of AP when you roll a 6 on the wound roll is just really good, because that 3 damage hit can sometimes take out things that your opponent won't expect. So just focus on that unit in most cases and it'll feel great. Moving on to number 5, Isha's Fury. This is basically a reactive grenade stratagem, 9-inch range, and again, no visibility requirement, which is great because this is one that does affect our opponent and we don't even need visibility of them. It is specifically at the end of a movement, so not the beginning of movement, nothing to do with the charge phase, but it does include advances or fallback. And so what we're going to look for here is just value per wound. It's similar to the grenade stratagem. If you're used to paying attention to what you're using grenades on, you generally are going to want to use it on units that have a high point per wound ratio. So things obviously like Custodes. Now, Custodes sometimes have protection against mortals, but you're looking for things like that where each unit costs 60 to 75 points, and so every one of their wounds is like 20 to 25 points. But if you can get around 16 to 25 point per wound models that you're putting these mortal wounds on, that's generally going to be the value you're looking for. So find those elite infantry. I mean, even Eldar, I mean, you put that into a squad of Howling Banshees that are moving up to charge you, and you could easily kill 4 of them or 3 of them, and then they put a wound on their Exarch, and you've easily done at least 60 some points of killing into your opponent's army with just 1 CP. And it can really soften the blow of an incoming enemy, and it's also great for just kind of dealing with your opponent putting units on objectives. And so when they go to move that unit onto an objective, you can have your unit that is either contains a Psyker, or one of my favorites is the Warlock on the bike, and it can be hiding in a rune but close enough to the objective to where if your opponent's trying to, just say for example, move a unit that has a few wounds left that they're not worried about dying, but they want to do a secondary objective. So let's say they want to cleanse an objective. They move on to that objective, but they've moved within 9 inches of your Psyker. Boom, Isha's Fury, and you wipe out that unit, and now they don't have a unit to cleanse. Or to even require you to shoot at to get off the objective. And so it's a great way to clean those kind of things up. Or maybe they're going to use a unit to move block you, and they have, again, just a few infantry left from a unit you've already shot in a previous turn, but they're just using it to move block you and try to keep you from getting somewhere. Isha's Fury, again, we hit them, we wipe it out, and now we don't have to worry about it. And so just think about some of those specific cases where taking out the last couple wounds off of a unit can make the difference in a big way, and you'll find some great value in Isha's Fury.
This is a stratagem that you'll probably be trying to use almost every turn. It just gives us a lot of value, especially into targets, as I've mentioned, and also ones with good invulnerable saves or just good saves, just things that are hard to get damage onto. And using this in conjunction with grenades on your turn, and then hitting them with this on their turn, we can really chip down some units that we otherwise would have to spend multiple turns taking out because they're just so hard to kill. And, if you have a big Bellicor coming your way, and he's trying to get in range to come charge you, you could hit him with this, and then on your turn hit him with some grenades, and now you may have cut him down almost in half. So this is a great stratagem that you'll want to use often and be looking for the value. And it's really easy to get the value out of it, honestly. But just stick to these ideas and you'll see that it does very good work for you. All right, we're down to the last stratagem, Psychic Shield. Easiest way to think of this is Lone Op 18. We got our 9-inch range, no visibility requirements from a Psyker, and it works until the end of the phase. So this is great because it's not just the one unit that they're trying to shoot at us, it works against their entire army. So as soon as we apply this to, say, our Dark Reaper sitting in the back corner, or our Guardian Brick sitting on our home objective, they're no longer going to be hit us with indirect fire, they're no longer going to be able to shoot us with something across the board. They have to be within 18 inches to get a shot at us. So it's a nice counter to indirect in one aspect. Of course, they're going to be able to shoot something else, so it's not really a complete counter, but it does allow us to pick a unit that we really don't want to be hit by the indirect, and we can just stop it from happening. It can also be a bait against our opponents, so if we set up our Guardian Brick and have the Bright Lance shooting something across the map, or just set our Dark Reapers up somewhere, like in a corner, where we're making them think that we think they're safe, and then they move a tank to take a long shot and try to rip them up. We can then Psychic Shield them and make it so that they can't get that shot. And so now their tank is exposed, and a lot of times if you set up your Dark Reapers, I find work for this especially well, where your Dark Reapers are sitting like on a flank or in a corner, and your opponent goes to move a tank to take a shot. The problem is that often they're not going to have another target to shoot. And so it really just makes it so that they expose something with no exchange fire, and we really get value out of it in those instances. The other thing that's really nice is we still have fade back, and with a Guardian Defender unit, we actually have multiple instances of fade back. So you can move up your Guardian Defenders, let them get shot once. Most of the time with your -1 to wound that's naturally built in with the Warlock Conclave, you're not going to take too much damage. You fade them back behind a ruin, then your opponent goes to shoot something else, you can fade that back, and then your opponent goes to shoot something else, and you say shield it. And so now they're just really struggling to get more than one shot into our targets, or our units, if they are trying to shoot at long range. And so it can be just one more aspect of protecting our units, and it works very good in all those instances. One last note I want to make with this, as far as indirect is concerned, the thing that you might want to consider is indirect. A lot of times I found that opponents will take multiple units of indirect fire, and one thing you want to think about is whether or not you want to split that fire up. And this gives us the option a lot of times to do so. So, for example, they're hitting our Storm Guardian squad, but maybe our Storm Guardian squad's getting a little light for what we need to screen out our deployment zone. But maybe we'll let them hit us once, and depending on how many units we lose, let's say we lose 3 of our Guardians. Well, we may not want to lose more than that because we just need those models back there for screening. So then we apply Psychic Shield. Well, now they have to pick a different target to shoot. And so they can't just dump all 3 units of indirect fire into our Storm Guardians, or could be any of the other targets. Like we let them hit one shot into our Dark Reapers, but we don't want any more. They killed a couple of them. We don't want to lose any more. We still want that firepower. And so we Psychic Shield them, so then they have to pick a different target. So also consider spreading out that indirect fire, and sometimes that can help mitigate a total loss of a unit and help us keep more units on the board so we can have more options for either taking shots or doing secondaries. And with Psychic Shield done, that finishes up what I wanted to go over as far as the stratagem. So let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so now that we've dug into the detachment rules, the stratagems, let's talk about some of the synergies that these things have with the Aeldari units. And first I want to talk about Psykers. Now this one's obvious. We need Psykers to apply our stratagems and to basically project our ability to use our stratagems. So first and foremost, they are our stratagem support. They're key to the detachment, and we need Psykers in our army to really just be able to use our detachment at all. So I really recommend that you don't have less than 4 individual Psyker units as like a starting point, and I would highly recommend more than that. One thing we have to be considerate of, though, is our Psykers are pretty fragile. Our Warlock on Bike has only a few wounds and toughness 4 and a 4-up invuln, and no lone op and no real way to really be protected other than being put in a unit with some bodyguards. And the bodyguards that we can put around our Psykers in general are also very fragile. So we're pretty limited on durability when it comes to our Psykers. There's kind of an exception when it comes to the aircraft, but let's be honest, the aircraft Psyker unit is extremely poorly priced and not worth taking, so we won't even consider that. And we lost our Psyker Wraithlord too, so we're kind of out of ideas for tough Psykers, so we're going to have to be using them in other ways. Now, we do have Farseers that can have the Warlock Conclave, and they can have -1 to wound, and yes, that helps, and we could put a bunch of models around our Psykers, like a Guardian Brick, and that helps, but it starts to get expensive to where we can't keep spending that many points just to get Psykers on the board. So we are going to be taking some lone Psykers, and I highly recommend the Warlocks on Bike. The Warlocks on Bike are the same cost as the Warlocks on Foot, and they pretty much do everything that the Warlock on Foot does, but better, with the one exception that because it's a mounted unit, it cannot have the Stratagems cast on itself. Now, it still can do the Stratagems for all of our other infantry and the ones against our opponent, but it cannot teleport itself, and it cannot receive Forewarned to protect itself. So that is the difference and biggest difference between the Warlock on Foot and Warlock on Bike. But the Warlock on Bike is so much faster. It really, to me, feels like you're getting a lot more value. It's also tougher. It has more wounds, or an extra wound, I should say, and even a little bit of extra firepower with a little shuriken catapult. So I do think the Warlock on Bike is much better value, but the Warlock on Foot can be teleported into opponent's backline to do established locus or behind enemy lines, and so there is a benefit to having a solo Warlock on Foot that can do some secondaries for you, and if you lose him, he's only 45 points, not the biggest deal. But it's kind of the same way with the bikes, because if you end up losing the bike, it's 45 points, it's not a big deal, so it's great to send onto a point just to force your opponent to respond. It's also nice for setting up the Presentiment of Dread, so you can move that Warlock on Bike. He has to be exposed because he does have to have visibility, and he has to be within 18 inches, which means he may be in range for charges or getting shot the next turn. So instead of exposing one of your Guardian Bricks or something that you really don't want to take too much firepower against it, you can just use the bike and still get off the Presentiment Dread and mess with your opponent in that way. So we do have to keep all these things in mind, but I recommend putting in as many Warlocks on Bike as you can. I think 2 minimum, and really if you can put in 3, because you'll just get so much use out of them, and they can just be places that they need to be to make sure we're getting our stratagems on our infantry. Because being able to spread them out and then moving 14 inches and even faster if we need them to, and even in some cases you can just advance them and they're flying across the board, being able to get in places to get our units forewarned or moving forward with some Howling Banshees to try to help keep them protected and possibly cast Isha's Fury on something coming in. So there's just all sorts of reasons the Warlocks on Bike are good. And another one that I want to point out specifically with the Warlocks on Bike is their ability to keep up with the Wraithlords. So if you do bring Wraithlords, it's a Psyker unit that is faster than the Wraithlord, and so can actually keep up with it with no issue and get in position to help the Wraithlord. If the Wraithlord needs to charge onto a point, for example, it can move on ahead in expectation that the Wraithlord is going to be charging forward after the move. And so sometimes you have to consider that, whereas a Warlock on Foot would move forward, but it may not be able to move far enough that the Wraithlord doesn't also move forward just as far, but then charges, a 6 or 7 inch charge, and all of a sudden your Wraithlord's getting too far away from your Warlock on Foot, possibly, depending on exactly, how the battlefield's set up. So you just have to keep that in mind and just make sure we get our Psykers on the board. Now, our Psykers are leaders, And it's kind of interesting what they did in one of the recent updates. They made it so that our Warlocks on Bike and our Warlock Conclave are leaders, but not characters. And this is so nice, and another reason why I highly recommend the Warlocks on Bike, more so even than the Warlocks on Foot, because the Warlocks on Foot are characters. So unfortunately, if our opponent is able to kill a 2-wound model, that single model that's 2 wounds with a 4 invuln and 3 toughness, almost anything in the game can just kill that, even without hardly trying. And so it's very easy to give up assassination on a turn when we were running with foot warlocks, so you do have to be kind of cognizant of that. And the Warlocks on Bike, on the other hand, do not count towards that, and same with the Warlock Conclave. So we can make it much more difficult for our opponent to get Assassinate if we focus with the Warlocks on Bike, and then we have our Conclaves helping protect our Farseers. And then it becomes a lot more difficult for our opponent to cut through all the wounds to get to our Farseer, and also the bikes just don't count for them. So it's a great thing to use. So just keep those things in mind. Remember the character keyword differences between the different Warlocks, and try not to set yourself up to be taken advantage of with Assassinate too badly. Okay, so infantry are the only things that we can target with our stratagems as far as in our own forces. So we are going to be an infantry heavy list in general, because that is the only things that we have stratagem support for. That doesn't mean it's the only thing that we'll be taking. We've already talked about Warlocks on Bike, but it is going to be the majority of our list, I think, in a good list for Seer Council. So with that in mind, we do have to be thinking about our battle focus economy. We don't have any way, like some of the other detachments, to boost the number of battle focus tokens we have or change what they do. And so we do need to use them carefully, and I generally recommend that you always keep one during your opponent's turn, just to cause more headache again and cause more mental stress load on the opponent for them figuring out what we are going to do in reaction to what they do. They don't know what unit we're going to move when they shoot. They do know that we can do it automatically or for free with our Guardian Defenders, but they don't know what other unit that we might move. And since we have pretty much all infantry, most everything is going to have the ability to use a battle focus token to do a move. And if they fall back, we might do the opportunity seized and move back. If they shoot one of our units, we could either psychic shield it or move it back with fade away. So just make sure you try to keep a battle focus token for your opponent's turn, so that way you can cause them some more headaches. Now, infantry in 10th edition have great mobility because they can go through ruins without any obstruction. And so they just have great speed in general. And the things that we're going to want to take to benefit us most are going to be our fast units. And so I really think that the things that synergize well with Seer Council are things that are also very mobile and very fast. So we're talking warp spiders, we're talking swooping hawks, even the bikes to one extent. Our wind riders, our shroud runners have some synergies there, and just anything that can move fast so we can change where our force concentration is on the board. And I think it's one of the key factors, and one of the most interesting ways to play Seer Council is to make it an army that specializes in being exactly where it needs to be to take out the enemy forces in one portion of the table. And so we can go on our opponent's flank and just completely wipe them out with almost our entire army, because our entire army is so fast. And then the things that are not quite as fast, like a Guardian Brick, we can teleport. And so now we have a massive amount of firepower teleporting. We have Warp Spiders teleporting in. We have Janezar with the Howling Banshees auto-advancing and using a Battle Focus token. They're going 16 inches. We have Baharoth and the Hawks dropping down, and we can just apply most of our army at any one place in the board that we need, and then as our opponent tries to respond and tries to move things back around to deal with that, we can do it all over again, move most our entire army into a completely different section of the board and wipe that out. And so we can just apply our specialists, things like fire dragons, for example, right where we need them to be, even when they're already on the board. So our fire dragons don't really need to transport because we can just drop them just outside 9 inches of a monster or vehicle. And there we go. They're right on target. And our opponent has to try to figure out a way to screen all this. And I can tell you in my experience that it just can't really be done. It's just so hard to screen when your opponent can put any infantry unit anywhere they want outside of 9 inches. It's not just coming in on the outside 6 inches of the board from strategic reserves like you would normally have to do with the fire dragons. We're just dropping those things anywhere we want that's outside of 9 inches of our opponent. And the ability for us to cut through screens is also phenomenal. Baharoth and the Hawks are great at it. We can use Wind Riders to do it, but if we can cut out their screening units, which we can generally do pretty quickly. Warp Spiders, for example, also great at it in most cases. Once we cut through those screens, then their whole army is just vulnerable to where we want to teleport our power units, like the fire dragons and whatever else that we need to move, our Farseer Guardian Brick. So just keep that in mind when you're trying to make your game plan for how to deal with your opponent. And if they are doing a good job screening, then take out the screens the turn before your go turn. And that'll really help us to apply our firepower exactly where we need it. And when Eldar can do that, then that's how you win. I mean, Eldar really are good when you get the units into the targets that they like to shoot. And so I think Seer Council, with its mobility and speed and the things it brings us, is just phenomenal at that and really plays into the strength of the Eldar. The other aspect of it that I kind of already mentioned a little bit is long-range shooting. So anything that we can do to have some nice long-range shooting is also a benefit, and also I think synergizes well, especially if it's infantry. So that is going to be generally our Hawks and our Dark Reapers, and Dark Reapers obviously being the best example because of how far they can shoot. The Dark Reapers can help us apply extra firepower on different parts of the board. We can even teleport a brick of the Dark Reapers to right where they need to be to put a bunch of firepower into a target from a long distance, completely safe because we know that they're going to be so far away from our opponent that there's not really going to be a way for them to get to the Dark Reapers, and we can also psychic shield them if they try to set up a shot to get back at the Dark Reapers. So Dark Reapers are very scary for our opponents, and I found in most of my games that my Dark Reapers end up getting to shoot generally 3 or 4 turns of the game, and they get to have their value from their shooting over and over and over again with almost no reprisal. The enemies just generally can't get an answer to them because of how we can place them with our teleport and how we can protect them with Psychic Shield. So Dark Reapers have a great synergy with Seer Council, and I highly recommend you take at least 1 squad. I've also been taking 2 squads and found that even 2 sets of 5 even work well because I can have them on different sides of the board. And if I need them to work together, I can teleport 1 squad to the other and have them both shoot into the same target if need be. But it's just very nice having the ability to have some long-range firepower just chipping away at some of those vehicles or whatever it might be. The Dark Reapers do a good job and do a lot of different targets. So definitely think that they have a great synergy with this detachment. And then the last thing, as far as the infantry that we're looking at, one thing we want to find value in is infantry that have their full strength when they're outside of 9 inches of the target. And so what I mean by that is we're going to be looking at things that benefit us at that greater than 9 inch range and bring some benefit at that point. And I think the best example of this is Fuegan. So Fuegan added to the Fire Dragons. When you put him with a squad and have the Exarch of the squad have a Fire Pike, now Fuegan and the Exarch both will be in Melta range as long as you're within 12 inches. So we can teleport them right inside 12 inches, put the rest of the fire dragons behind them, because now the fire dragons have an 18-inch total range, and we can't get them in Melta range themselves. But we have two weapons that still have Melta shooting into a monster or vehicle, and then the other fire dragons behind still being able to pop d6 damage in. And it's a very difficult threat for an opponent to deal with. And Fuegan really synergizes with the Seer Council, and I think he is something that I would say you would want in every single list, because he just takes the dragons, and with this detachment in particular, because of our ability to place them, just really amps the difficulty for our opponent to screen them or to deal with them. Because not only do they have to just kind of screen him, they almost can't, because at the end of the day, we can even set our fire dragons 18 inches out, and no, we're not going to get Melta, but we're still going to get 6 shots, all rerolling everything into a monster and vehicle, doing d6 damage for everything that goes through with AP4. And if you really needed it into a 2-up save target that doesn't have an end ball, and you can even throw on Fate Inescapable. It's not a bad thing to do if it's a target that's high priority and has a 2-up save that's in cover. When you get them to ignore cover and they're doing 4 AP, and then when they hit those crits and they go to basically make it even a unit that has a 2-up save not able to make a save, even when they're in cover, it gets pretty wild. And the fact that the fire dragons can do that at 18 inches because of Fuegan's boost to their range. And then even further than that, if for whatever reason you really are afraid to have your fire dragons too close to the opponent, there's just not a good place to put them, because if they're within 18 inches, you might be in range for some kind of counter charge or whatever it might be. You can even put them at 24 inches, and Fuegan and the fire pike are still going to get shots off. And you still have two very strong weapons putting damage into a monster or vehicle that's going to be hard for them to stop. And they're 24 inches away, so now we're much less likely to be tagged by an opponent in melee, and they're going to have trouble putting much any shots into the fire dragons, not only because of the positioning we put them in, but because of Psychic Shield. And so they're going to have a hard time getting units within 18 inches of them if we are shooting at something 24 inches away, and that might be the closest target. And so everything else is even further away. They have to try to figure out how to get within 18 inches to shoot them. And so we can keep our fire dragons safe and still be getting shots off at long range until we're ready to teleport them in and get the Melta with Fuegan and the fire pike. So the fire dragons, even just a 5-man with Fuegan, is very difficult for the opponent to deal with, and can really be getting value throughout the game in a way that usually the fire dragons just don't. The only way that fire dragons get as much value in some of the other detachments are that when they're coming in and out of the transports. But the nice thing for us is we don't have to spend the points on the transport. We can just use the fire dragons on foot and still keep them protected and still get a lot of value out of them without putting points into a transport that is very inefficient when it comes to actual damage. And so we can use those points to put even more things on the board for us to do damage with. And I think it's a great synergy. So yes, that was kind of a long-winded talk about Fuegan, but I do think he is amazing in this detachment, and I really wanted to dig into him a little bit there, because I can't really recommend him enough. And I think he is, as you'll see when we get to the tier list, I do think he's pretty much an auto take. And you'll want to take him in pretty much every list that you make with 5 fire dragons at least. So another example would be Asterman. Very unfortunate Asterman got a nerf, but at the end of the day, he still gets full value shooting with the Dire Avengers outside of 9 inches. Between 9 and 12 inches, he can still get his sustained hits 1 when he's with Dire Avengers, and so he's still going to be able to shoot well at that range. Since he has that 24-inch range, even though the Dire Avengers themselves will not get sustained hits 1 because they're going to be outside of 9, but Asterman will still benefit from them and their little benefit for their unit. And then Asterman can also be held back, and you can put the Dire Avengers Asterman at 18 inches, shoot with all of them, then move them 6. even after they teleport, which is great because then it's going to be really difficult for your opponent to ever really hit them. So even with the Asterman nerf, I think he's at this point very inefficient, but it's still a unit that you can get value because it's going to keep shooting throughout the game. So I don't think he's totally dead. I have generally dropped him in my list because I have found that he just doesn't do nearly enough. And the Dire Avengers are now pretty expensive and also pretty inefficient. But there's no doubt that he is a decent harass unit that is probably going to be able to get a lot of shots off through the game and be able to play very safe. So you can keep him in mind if you like him. I won't completely discourage you from taking him, but he's definitely no S tier unit at this point.
So keep these things in mind when you're determining which infantry you're going to be taking and how they can be benefiting. And just to kind of give you a counter example, just fire dragons on their own, they're not going to be able to get melt on any of their shooting. Doesn't mean that you can't take another unit of fire dragons, because you can always rapid ingress them and they can still have value. But you just want to be thinking about how are these units going to synergize with Unshrouded Truth. And another niche example is warp spiders. And you may not do this often, but it's a good idea to keep in mind that you can always Unshrouded Truth them as opposed to flicker jump. And do this when you don't need them to be any closer than 9 inches to an enemy and still get their shooting off, but you still need them to move further than their 12 or 14 inches they normally could. And it can save you from having to take the hazard test, in essence, when you flicker jump. This could mean that you get more shooting off because you didn't have one or two of your warp spiders fail and die before you get your shots off. And since our infantry are elite in general for the amount of wounds that they have and the cost that they have, it's kind of nice to make sure you're keeping your units alive. So just keep little things like that in mind. You never know when maybe it's just worth spending one of our CP to keep those warp spiders alive when we don't have to move one of our other units. And Unshrouded Truth will really help you when you see all the different ways that it can be used and the benefits you get with our infantry. It's one of the best stratagems that we have. So make good use of it and use it in creative ways. So Wraithlords is one that I wanted to talk about specifically and kind of on its own because it has an interesting synergy with this detachment. The big obvious one is that we're already taking Psykers and we're going to have our Psykers spread out. And so we're going to have support for the Wraithlord and getting its ballistic skill and weapon skill improved pretty much anywhere that we're going to be wanting that Wraithlord to be. And we even have some Warlocks on bike that can move quickly behind it and stay within the 12-inch range to make sure it continues to get that benefit. But on the other hand, it does not have stratagem support itself. We can't use any of our stratagems on the Wraithlord. The Wraithlords don't have battle focus, since we're not in Spirit Conclave, and so there's no out-of-phase movement for the Wraithlords. With all that said, it's still an extremely efficient unit. Currently, it costs 140 points, and because you can pick a target to reroll hit rolls and wound rolls of 1, this allows us to have, in essence, a flex piece that can help us have a more and better response to our opponent's army, regardless of what they bring. Because infantry, vehicles, and monsters, and in some cases mounted, are just going to be some of the most common keywords that we're going to run into. And so we can really respond to a guard list that has a lot of infantry, easy keyword, or a guard list that has a lot of tanks, and we go for vehicle. And so we're able to just swing our Wraithlords into whatever we feel like we may not have enough answers to in our list naturally, so that we can have a unit that is efficient into that particular type of keyword. And so even though we don't have direct detachment support in the sense of stratagems, the Psykers we have being near the Wraithlords, it's definitely a unit that is worth considering, and I think fits pretty well into our list. But I don't think it's something that you have to take, but I did want to point out that specifically the Wraithlord, as far as the Wraith constructs, when you're looking at those, is definitely one that you could consider, and I think much more so than the other Wraith construct options. As far as other units and synergy or lack thereof, transports is an interesting one. I don't want to tell you that transports are completely unnecessary, but if there was going to be a detachment where you're not going to take transports, this would probably be the one. Unshrouded Truth just gives us incredible mobility. We can get our infantry generally where we need them to be, and so transports just lose a lot of value because we don't need that extra speed. On the other hand, they do provide some extra safety, but we don't have ways to get our infantry back in like some of the other detachments at the end of the turn. So it does limit the use of transports in this detachment compared to some of the other detachments. And really the same thing goes for vehicles in general. We can definitely bring vehicles, but just know that they are going to be even less efficient in this detachment than most of the others because we don't have any stratagem support for them. And so we're not going to be able to really do much for them. And we're going to bring them specifically just for what they add in value to our army. For example, Warwalkers can get us extra AP, and that is nice, but I think right now they're just too inefficient as a whole and cost too much for bringing that one bonus. And so in general, I don't think our lists are generally going to have much in the way of vehicles. Same thing with Infiltrate and Scout. I think there's some great options that we have, and I would say you always want to take at least one infiltrating squad like Rangers. The Striking Scorpions are still good with their Infiltrate and Scout. I personally think they're a bit overpriced right now. When you can get Rangers for 55 points and do a lot of the same task that you're trying to get accomplished with the Scorpions that are now 85 points. And if you want two infiltrating squads, now you're talking a difference of 60 points. I tend to now just run a Ranger squad or two, and I think that helps us have more points for our other units that are going to be more deadly. And so I would stick to Rangers as far as infiltration is concerned. And then as far as scouting, we're really not looking to run into our opponent's face. We really want to play smart and careful and really be more defensive until we are ready to, in essence, alpha strike where we want to go. Because we have the ability to teleport a unit exactly where we need it to be, and then we're generally going to be taking things that are highly mobile so that we can concentrate our forces somewhere specifically on the table. And so we don't really need to be scouting too far forward into our opponent other than to, for example, move block or do a secondary. So things like Shroud Runners, I did want to point out specifically that it's very nice to have Ignores cover, and Shroud Runners do provide it, but we do have a stratagem that already does that for us. I don't want to count Shroud Runners out because the Guardian blocks love having Ignore cover, and so having a unit that just gives it to us is another way for us to avoid having to spend one of our CP on that stratagem, or be able to get it on a couple different targets. We could put it on our Guardian brick that's going to be shooting some things, and then on a different part of the board we can use our Shroud Runners to pick off a couple of wounds on something, but then allow the rest of our army to shoot at it without it having cover, because we are going to be taking things that like to shoot and ignore cover. It is something that does synergize, but I definitely wouldn't take more than one, and it's definitely not a unit that you have to take. But Shroud Runners are still worth considering because just because we have a stratagem that gives us the same ability doesn't mean that you should just not take them. And I would recommend at least trying a couple of games out with them, and you can kind of see yourself that sure, we could spend a CP on Fade Inescapable, or we could maybe spend that CP once per game, and then the rest of the game we've been able to use the Shroud Runners to strip cover and that allows us to use our natural CP for some of our other stratagems. So definitely keep them in mind, but I definitely don't think they're an auto take or something that we need to run, because we do have the option when needed to get ignores cover. And then as far as gap filling is what I decided to call this, sometimes in our list we're looking for answers or a unit that can be an answer to multiple different types of targets. And one that I think is very good for this is actually the Harlequins. We are allowed to take one troop master, and so a troop master leading a troop, and even consider taking a Star Weaver to allow them to get back in at the end of the fight phase, is actually not a terrible idea, and one of the transports that I would actually probably take over the other transports, because the Harlequins do not get stratagem support, but they actually don't really need it. They pretty much like to move out, throw grenades, shoot their guns, charge in, do a bunch of damage, and then get back in the Star Weaver. And it makes it hard for opponents to be able to efficiently trade with the Harlequin squad, because the Harlequin squad is going to be 160 points at the current time for a troop and troop master, and the Star Weaver is 80. And so if the opponent puts the firepower to kill the Star Weaver, they're almost definitely going to be exposing more than 80 points worth of units to do so. And if we position correctly, we can have our Harlequins get out safely after the Star Weaver explodes. And then on the next turn, we can move our Harlequins forward and get much more value out of what the Harlequins' damage can do into some of their units versus just losing that Star Weaver. And the Harlequins also are great into all sorts of different targets. They're efficient into Terminators and Space Marines and even vehicles. I've had a troop master and troop come out, throw grenades, and shoot a Predator to death, and then charge a different Predator and take it down to 3 wounds. And so we can definitely get a lot of value out of a unit like Harlequins. And another one to consider that doesn't have stratagem support and you may not think is necessarily synergistic is actually the mounted units that we have. And this is because our mounted units actually can be gap fillers. And I think the Shining Spears are a great example of that. Yes, it's kind of expensive, but it can be an answer to a lot of different types of targets. And so it can be kind of a flex piece, similar to how I was talking about the Wraithlord. Can be a flex piece into multiple different types of targets. Wind Riders are great. They do a bunch of damage. They are a bit fragile, but if we're going to be taking Warlock Skyrunners anyways, we can take a brick of Skyrunners with the Warlock, and they all get ignores cover built in. And so now their damage is has a pretty good buff there for the Shuriken Cannons in particular. And so a lot of times it's worth considering bringing some Windrunners, especially if in your own local meta there's a lot of Marine equivalent units that you need to deal with. The Wind Riders do a great job with that. So just keep some of these other units in mind. They're not exactly the most synergistic, but I wanted to point out a few key units that I think do have synergy in a way with the detachment and can bring some value to help us deal with some units that we may have either trouble with, or not necessarily just have trouble, but just have enough answers for. Because yes, we're going to be bringing the Guardian squad, and yes, we can bring the Dark Reapers, but the Dark Reapers can struggle sometimes into certain targets, and our opponent might bring more vehicles, for example, than the amount of fire dragons that we brought can answer. And so having some units that can flex into that and be like, you know what, I'm good into vehicles and I'm good into infantry, and whatever else my opponent's going to bring, I'm going to be efficient as far as doing damage into anything they bring. And so having units that can be answers for us in that way can really help flesh our army lists out so that we can really respond. I think that's one of the best strengths of this detachment, is because of the way we can build our list, we can afford to bring some of these other units that don't necessarily fit the perfect synergy per se. They're not a Psyker, they're not even infantry, for example, but they can really help our list handle things that I think some of the other detachments don't do as well, because it's harder for them to include because they really want to focus on, just aspect warriors, for example. And so that'll conclude what I kind of wanted to get over as far as synergies in the detachment and the different kinds of units that we want to consider with this detachment. All right, if you made it this far, I really appreciate it. I know this was a very long video. I personally like long format videos that really go into very specific and useful tactics and tips, and I really want to bring value to you. So if you did find value in this video, please leave a like, comment, let me know about something maybe I didn't mention, and subscribe. I would greatly appreciate it. And as far as what's coming next, the next video, I'm still going to be focusing on Seer Council. I think there really is just that much to go over, and I wanted to do a tier list with Seer Council being the only detachment considered for that tier list. So we'll be going over the Psykers, the Infantry, and then the other units that we can take. And I want to also go into some of the math behind why we want to take some of those units and what I would consider core units to the detachment, and also give you ideas on the expectations that I have on what those units are going to be targeting, and show you that we have force concentration with this detachment, and kind of go over the math behind that as well. And then, of course, some sample list. There's definitely a couple main ways that I think this detachment is played, and I wanted to go over a couple approaches and give an example of a balanced list, and then also a skewed list, or maybe a couple. And then lastly, some strategy and tactics, stratagem examples as far as use cases and niche uses, positioning, deployment examples of how to deploy, and also matchup considerations. And that's kind of why I wanted to really make a whole nother video on it, because I do want to talk about some of what this attachment brings, and then how it goes into some of the other factions that our opponent might bring. And so there's quite a bit, and let me know if you're looking forward to the next video. I know I'm looking forward to making it and bringing it out, and I really do hope that this video brought something in light for you that maybe you didn't consider, or another perspective on a unit or stratagem that maybe you hadn't thought of, because I really enjoy Aeldari. I really enjoy 40k, and 10th edition has been a blast, and I want to help the community continue to do better and better. And I think Seer Council is just so much fun to play that it was the detachment that I wanted to do first. So I hope you learned something new, and definitely, again, ask questions and let me know about anything else that maybe you thought of in the comments below. Appreciate your time, and look forward to the next video.